My brother Jake's voice cut through the silent courtroom like a blade, dripping with theatrical contempt. No benefits, no claims, Your Honor. She's nothing but a fake veteran. His words were calculated, designed to humiliate me in front of our grieving family and destroy any claim I had to our father's inheritance. I sat perfectly still, my hands folded, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me break. But Jake had no idea what was coming. He didn't notice when my lawyer, Michael, rose without a word and handed a single sealed manila envelope to the bailiff. He didn't see the judge break the unfamiliar red wax seal, but everyone in that courtroom saw what happened next. The judge's face went white as he read the single sheet of paper inside. His eyes darted to the armed officers at the back of the room, and his voice became a strained, urgent command that shattered the silence. Officers, seal this courtroom immediately. The sound of the locks engaging was deafening. Jake's confident smirk melted into pure terror. That final, terrifying click was the result of a decision I'd made 2 months earlier, standing in a room filled with the scent of lilies and quiet grief. It was the day of my father's funeral reception, and I was watching my brother Jake hold court in our family's living room. The air was thick with the scent of white roses and that particular silence that follows grief. Jake stood near the mantel, accepting condolences with one hand while checking his phone with the other. His success was so loud it could drown out anyone else's existence, and today was no different. I stood alone by the kitchen doorway, a ghost at my own father's wake. The mourners moved around me like I was invisible, drawn instead to Jake's magnetic presence. He had that effect on people. At 35, he was everything our family had dreamed of. A successful corporate lawyer with a corner office in downtown Chicago, a house in Lincoln Park that cost more than most people made in a lifetime, and a confidence that filled every room he entered. I was 32, and, according to my family's carefully constructed narrative, a disappointment. The daughter who had washed out of law school, who had settled for a boring government job in Washington, D.C., who lived alone in a small apartment and never brought anyone home for the holidays. They had a nickname for me, one they thought I never heard. They called me the Paper Pusher, a title meant to capture what they saw as my complete and utter mediocrity. Colonel Peterson, a family friend and retired Marine, made his way over to me. His weathered face was lined with genuine sympathy as he approached. "Sarah," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of someone who understood loss. "I'm sorry for your loss. Your father was a good man." Before I could respond, Jake appeared beside me like a shark sensing blood in the water. He draped his arm around my shoulders with practiced familiarity, his grip just tight enough to feel possessive. "Don't mind my sister," he said to Colonel Peterson, his voice carrying that particular brand of condescension he'd perfected over the years. "She's got one of those government desk jobs where they count paper clips and track office supplies." Colonel Peterson's eyes flickered toward me, a question forming in them. But I just offered a tight, empty smile and said nothing. I'd learned long ago that making a scene would only make things worse. Jake wasn't finished. He never was when he had an audience. "We were all so proud when she said she was serving our country," he continued, his voice dripping with mock sincerity. "But I think the most dangerous thing she's ever done is get a paper cut filing reports." He chuckled at his own joke, and a few family members within earshot laughed along. In that moment, watching Jake erase my existence so effortlessly, something inside me finally went cold. He thought he was just telling his favorite joke, the one about his disappointing sister and her meaningless job. He had no idea he was committing slander that would soon be delivered under oath in a court of law. To understand why my lawyer's envelope would contain more power than my father's entire estate, you have to understand the two lives I was living. My family saw me as a story they had written themselves, a narrative of quiet failure and missed opportunities. It began when I supposedly dropped out of Georgetown Law School after my first year, overwhelmed by the pressure and unable to keep up with the demanding coursework. That was the official story. The truth was that I had been recruited by the Defense Intelligence Agency during my second semester. My professors had noticed my aptitude for pattern recognition and analytical thinking. My thesis advisor, who turned out to have connections I never suspected, had quietly passed my name along to people who moved in shadows. The recruitment process was unlike anything I could have imagined. It started with what seemed like a routine academic scholarship interview. I sat in a sterile conference room across from two people who introduced themselves only as Dr. Smith and Dr. Jones. They asked questions that seemed unrelated to academics. How did I feel about long term overseas assignments? How well did I handle stress? Did I have any moral objections to work that might never be publicly acknowledged? By the end of that 2 hour interview, my entire life trajectory had changed. Within 6 months, I had officially withdrawn from law school due to personal reasons and begun training at a facility that didn't appear on any public maps. My family mourned my failure. They had no idea I was being molded into something they couldn't possibly comprehend. My cover story was perfect in its mundane believability. I was Sarah Moss, policy analyst level GS 12, working for the Department of Defense in an office building in Crystal City. I analyzed budget reports and wrote memos about procurement procedures. It was the kind of job that made people's eyes glaze over at dinner parties, which was exactly the point. The reality was that I was Senior Intelligence Officer Sarah Moss, codename Echo 9, specializing in signals intelligence and human asset management in Eastern Europe. My office wasn't in Crystal City. It was in a sensitive compartmented information facility, buried 3 floors underground, where the only sound was the constant hum of servers processing secrets that could topple governments. My handler was Director Catherine Walsh, a woman who had been running covert operations since before I was born. She was the kind of person who could order a drone strike with the same calm demeanor she used to discuss the weather. I remember a conversation with her just weeks after my father's diagnosis, when I was struggling to balance my grief with an ongoing operation in Prague. Echo 9, she said over our secure connection, her voice cutting through the static. Asset Nightingale is reporting unusual movement at the target facility. We need immediate analysis of the intercepts. I was sitting in a hotel room overlooking the Vltava River, exhausted from 3 days of surveillance. My father had just started chemotherapy, and part of me wanted nothing more than to catch the next flight home. But I looked at the encrypted files spread across my laptop screen, data that could prevent a terrorist attack on American soil, and I knew what I had to do. Confirmed, I replied, my voice steady, despite the turmoil inside. I'm seeing the pattern. Nightingale is right. They're moving up their timeline. We have maybe 48 hours before they're operational. Your recommendation? We move tonight. I can get close enough to confirm the weapons cache location. If I'm right, we can take down the entire network before they know we're there. There was a pause on the line. That's a significant risk, Echo 9. If this goes wrong, we can't extract you. Your cover won't hold under that kind of scrutiny. I thought about my father lying in a hospital bed, probably wondering where his daughter was, why she couldn't even be there for his treatment. I thought about Jake, who would use my absence as another example of my selfishness and failure. And then I thought about the families who would never know that their lives had been saved by a decision made in a Prague hotel room. I understand, I said. Execute the operation. That night, I slipped through shadows and electronic surveillance to confirm the intelligence that led to the arrest of 12 terrorists and the seizure of enough explosives to level a city block. I never got a medal for it. There was no ceremony, no recognition, no way to explain to my family why their disappointment of a daughter had missed another important moment in their lives. My service was designed to be invisible, and it was. No DD 214 discharge papers, no Veterans Affairs benefits card, no flag ceremonies or parades. My war was fought in silence in places that didn't exist, against enemies whose names would never appear in history books. But my father saw glimpses of it. He never knew the details, but he noticed the long, unexplained absences, the sudden business trips that couldn't be discussed, the way I would sometimes stare off into the distance with a weight in my eyes that he recognized from his own father, who had served in Korea and never talked about what he'd seen there. In his final months, as the cancer ate away at his strength, he would look at me with a knowing sadness. You carry something heavy, don't you, sweetheart? He asked me one afternoon as I sat beside his hospital bed. something you can't share. I took his hand, feeling how thin and fragile it had become. I love you, Dad, I said, because it was the only truth I was allowed to tell him. He squeezed my fingers with what little strength he had left. I love you too, and I'm proud of you, even if I don't understand it all. Those words meant more to me than any commendation I'd ever received. When he died 3 weeks later, I was halfway around the world, managing the extraction of an asset whose cover had been blown in Moscow. I got the call from Jake while I was sitting in a safe house, watching security cameras for signs of hostile surveillance. Dad's gone, Jake said, his voice thick with grief and something that sounded like accusation. He asked for you at the end. Where the hell are you, Sarah? What could possibly be more important than being here for your own father's death? I closed my eyes, feeling a pain that cut deeper than any physical wound I'd ever sustained. I'm sorry, I whispered. I'm so sorry. Sorry doesn't bring him back, Jake snapped. Sorry doesn't make up for a lifetime of putting yourself first. But I guess that's just who you are, isn't it? The daughter who was too busy with her little government job to be here when it mattered. The line went dead, and I sat in that Moscow safe house, surrounded by weapons and encrypted communications equipment, crying for a father who had died, believing his daughter didn't love him enough to be there when he needed her most. The funeral was held 4 days later. I made it back just in time, stepping off a red-eye flight from Frankfurt with a cover story about a budget conference that had run long. My family's disappointment was palpable. They looked at me like I was a stranger who had wandered into their grief uninvited. During the service, I sat in the back row while Jake delivered a eulogy that painted our father as a man who had lived for his family, who had sacrificed everything for his children's success. He talked about the values Dad had instilled in them, the importance of dedication and service. He never mentioned me by name. At the reception afterward, the dynamic was clear. Jake was the grieving son, the successful lawyer who would carry on the family legacy. I was the absent daughter who had somehow managed to show up for the funeral but couldn't be bothered to be present for the dying. Mrs. Henderson from down the street pulled me aside near the kitchen, her eyes filled with sympathy. I'm so sorry for your loss, dear, she said. Your father talked about you often. He was so worried about you, traveling so much for work. He said you were doing something important, but he wished you could be home more. Before I could respond, Jake appeared beside us with that same possessive arm around my shoulders. Sarah's job keeps her busy, he said with a laugh that didn't reach his eyes. Government work, very important paper pushing in very important government buildings. Can't have the filing systems falling apart while she's away. Mrs. Henderson looked confused, glancing between us. Oh, I thought your father said she was in some kind of special service. Special services, Jake corrected smoothly. Special Services Division. They handle special paperwork for special projects. Very special indeed. The sarcasm dripped from every word. I watched Mrs. Henderson's face as she processed this, saw the moment when she decided Jake's version made more sense than whatever my father might have told her. After all, Jake was the successful one, the one with the explanations that fit into neat categories. Why would his sister be anything other than what she appeared to be? That night, after the last mourner had left and the dishes had been cleared away, our family gathered in Dad's study to hear the reading of his will. My mother, Patricia, sat in Dad's leather chair, looking smaller and more fragile than I had ever seen her. Jake sat across from her, confident and composed, already mentally calculating his inheritance. I sat by the window, half listening to the lawyer's droning recitation of legal language until he reached the section about the division of assets. Dad had left the house to my mother with provisions for her care. His investments and savings were to be divided equally between Jake and me, a decision that surprised no one. But then came the personal clause, a single sentence that my father had insisted on including, despite his lawyer's advice that such language was unnecessary. The lawyer cleared his throat and read it aloud. I wish to acknowledge my daughter, Sarah's quiet, unacknowledged service to our country, and express my hope that someday her sacrifice will be properly recognized. The silence that followed was deafening. My mother looked confused. Jake looked like he had been slapped. I felt my heart break all over again, realizing that my father had known more than he'd ever let on. Jake's reaction was immediate and explosive. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" he demanded, his lawyer mask slipping to reveal something ugly underneath. "Service? What service?" "She pushes papers for the Pentagon. She files reports." "What sacrifice?" The lawyer, an elderly man named Morrison who had known our family for decades, looked uncomfortable. "I advised your father that such personal language was unusual, but he insisted. He said it was important to him." "Important?" Jake stood up, his face flushing red. "This is manipulation, pure and simple." She filled his head with stories about her heroic government career to make herself look better. She lied to a dying man to get a bigger piece of his estate. "Jake," my mother said quietly, but he wasn't listening. "No, Mom. Don't you see what she's done?" Dad felt guilty about her pathetic life, so she spun him some fantasy about secret missions and classified work. She took advantage of his illness, his medication, his confusion. This is fraud. I sat perfectly still through his tirade, watching him work himself into a rage. I had seen this before, this pattern of Jake's where any challenge to his narrative had to be destroyed completely. He couldn't accept a version of reality where I had value he couldn't see and measure. "I'm contesting this will," he declared finally. "I'm going to prove in court that she manipulated our father with lies about fake military service. I'm going to expose her for the fraud she is." That was the moment everything changed. Up until then, this had been a family problem, an emotional issue that could be managed with careful words and strategic silence. But Jake's decision to challenge the will in court, to formally accuse me of fraud under oath, transformed our private dysfunction into something else entirely. This was no longer a family matter. It was an intelligence problem, and it required an operational solution. That night, I made a secure call to Michael Chen, a former JAG officer who had transitioned to civilian practice but maintained the security clearances necessary to handle cases involving classified personnel. I explained the situation in precise terms, watching the snow fall outside my hotel window. "My brother intends to challenge our father's will on the grounds that I committed fraud by misrepresenting my military service," I said. "He plans to argue in open court that I am a fake veteran who manipulated a dying man." There was a long pause on the encrypted line. "And your actual status?" "Active DIA, code name Echo 9. 15 years of classified service, including operations in Eastern Europe, Southeast Asia, and the Middle East. My service record is so classified that even most of my own agency doesn't have access to the full file." Another pause. "Jesus, Sarah. He has no idea what he's walking into, does he?" "None whatsoever." "What's your objective here?" I thought about Jake's confident sneer, about years of being dismissed and diminished, about my father dying while I was protecting people who would never know my name. I thought about the choice between preserving family relationships and protecting my operational security, and I realized there was no choice at all. "Total operational termination," I said, using the clinical language that made difficult, decisions easier to execute. I want this ended so completely that no further questions can ever be asked. That's going to require some very heavy artillery. Once we deploy this kind of documentation, there's no taking it back. Your brother isn't just going to be embarrassed. He's going to be on the federal government's radar, and that's not a comfortable place to be. I watched the snow swirl in the streetlight outside my window, thinking about all the times Jake had made me feel invisible, all the family dinners where my achievements were dismissed with a wave of his hand, all the years I had protected his comfortable world while he ridiculed the very idea that I might be capable of something important. "He chose this battlefield," I said finally. "I'm just going to win the war." The plan we developed was methodical and devastating. We would let Jake make his case, allow him to stand up in court under oath and formally accuse me of stolen valor. His arrogance was the bait, and we knew he would take it. While he prepared his insults and gathered his evidence of my supposed mediocrity, I would prepare the nuclear option. The document we requested was unlike anything most civilian lawyers had ever seen. It came not from the Department of Defense, but from the Office of the Director of National Intelligence itself. It wouldn't say what I did or where I had served, but it would confirm that my service was so highly classified that the court was legally prohibited from questioning it. The authorization required to produce such a document went all the way to the top of the intelligence community. It meant briefing officials who normally dealt with matters of international security about a family dispute in Chicago. But when Director Walsh learned that one of her most experienced officers was facing public accusations of stolen valor, she didn't hesitate. Echo 9 has been instrumental in operations that have saved countless American lives, she told the review board. Her cover has been maintained at significant personal cost for over a decade. If we allow this challenge to proceed without intervention, we not only betray one of our most dedicated officers, we set a precedent that could compromise the security of every NOC operative in the field. The document, when it was finally produced, was a masterpiece of bureaucratic intimidation. It was printed on special security paper with multiple authentication features. The letterhead bore the seal of the ODNI, and it was signed by officials whose names carried enough weight to stop traffic in Washington. But the real power wasn't in what the document said. It was in what it authorized. Upon presentation to the presiding judge, the court was required to clear all non-essential personnel and allow the judge to be read into my status in a classified briefing. For the duration of that briefing, the judge would essentially become part of the intelligence community, sworn to protect secrets that could affect national security. Michael warned me one final time before we proceeded. Once we detonate this thing, Sarah, your brother's life changes forever. He'll be questioned by federal agents. His law practice will be scrutinized. Every client, every case, every parking ticket will be examined. Are you prepared for that? I thought about Jake standing in our father's living room, telling Colonel Peterson that the most dangerous thing I'd ever done was get a paper cut. I thought about him planning to stand up in court and call me a liar and a fraud in front of our entire family. He made his choice. No, I said. Now he gets to live with the consequences. The courtroom was smaller than I had expected, with wood paneling that had darkened with age and windows that filtered the morning light into pale rectangles on the worn carpet. It was the kind of place where family disputes were settled with the measured weight of legal precedent, where emotions were supposed to be kept in check by the formal rituals of jurisprudence. Jake had arrived early, clearly savoring what he believed would be his moment of triumph. He sat at the plaintiff's table with his legal team, 3 attorneys from his firm who specialized in estate law and had no idea they were about to witness something that would haunt their careers. He wore his most expensive suit, the charcoal gray one he saved for closing arguments and client meetings that determined his year-end bonus. I sat at the defendant's table with Michael, wearing a simple navy dress and minimal jewelry. To anyone looking, I appeared to be exactly what my family had always claimed I was: unremarkable, forgettable, someone who belonged in the background of other people's important moments. My family filled the gallery behind Jake like a supportive wall of conviction. My mother sat in the front row, her hands folded in her lap, looking like she would rather be anywhere else. Behind her sat my Aunt Linda and Uncle Robert, cousins I hadn't seen in years, family friends who had known me since childhood. They were all there to witness what Jake had promised would be the final exposure of my lies. The judge, Honorable William Martinez, entered with the tired efficiency of a man who had presided over countless family disputes. He was in his early 60s, with gray hair and the kind of measured demeanor that comes from years of listening to people destroy each other with words. He looked at the packed courtroom with mild annoyance, clearly wondering why a simple will contest required such an audience. "This court is called to order in the matter of the estate of Robert Moss," he announced. "Mr. Jensen, you may present your opening statement." Jake stood with theatrical precision, straightening his tie before approaching the witness stand. He looked directly at the judge, establishing the kind of eye contact that had made him successful in corporate boardrooms, and began his performance. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying the perfect blend of gravity and sorrow. "This case is about more than money. It's about truth, justice, and the integrity of our legal system. My sister, Sarah Moss, has perpetrated a fraud so calculating, so cruel, that it defies comprehension." He paused, letting his words settle before continuing. "For years, she has told our family stories about her military service, vague tales of classified work and dangerous missions. She used these lies to manipulate our dying father, convincing him that she was some kind of unsung hero deserving of special recognition in his will. Jake turned slightly, making sure his voice carried to the gallery where our family sat watching. But the truth is simple and devastating. Sarah Moss has never served her country in any meaningful way. She has no discharge papers, no veterans benefits, no military ID. She works a desk job in a government building, filing reports and pushing papers. Her entire military persona is a fabrication designed to make herself seem important and to manipulate a vulnerable old man into giving her money that rightfully belongs to others. The words landed like physical blows, each accusation carefully crafted to paint me as not just a liar, but a predator who had taken advantage of her own father's weakness. I felt every eye in the courtroom focused on me, waiting for some reaction, some sign that Jake's accusations had found their target. I remained perfectly still, my hands folded on the table in front of me, my expression neutral. Inside, I felt the same cold clarity that had guided me through hostile interrogations and life threatening operations. This was just another mission, another situation that required patience and precision to achieve the desired outcome. Jake continued his opening statement for another 10 minutes, building his case with the methodical thoroughness of an experienced litigator. He presented evidence of my supposed failures, my withdrawal from law school, my unremarkable government job, my absence from family gatherings and important events. He painted a picture of a disappointing daughter who had constructed an elaborate fantasy to compensate for her mediocre reality. When he finished, he returned to his table with the satisfied confidence of a man who believed he had just delivered a knockout blow. He looked at me across the aisle, and I saw something in his eyes that went beyond legal strategy. This wasn't just about the will or the money. This was about narrative control, about maintaining his position as the successful child in a family where success was the only currency that mattered. Michael rose for our response, and I watched the subtle shift in his posture as he prepared to execute the first phase of our strategy. His opening statement was deliberately understated, almost boring in its simplicity. "Your Honor," he said, "my client looks forward to the opportunity to respond to these accusations with appropriate evidence. We ask only that the court consider all relevant documentation before reaching any conclusions about Ms. Moss's service record or her relationship with her father." It was intentionally anticlimactic, designed to lull Jake and his team into believing we had no real defense. Michael sat down without flourish, leaving the courtroom with the impression that we were simply going through the motions before an inevitable defeat. Judge Martinez nodded and called the first witness. Jake took the stand again, this time to testify under oath about my supposed deception. He spoke with conviction about my lack of military credentials, my absence during family crises, my pattern of telling stories that couldn't be verified. She claims to have been overseas on classified missions. Jake testified, his voice rising with indignation. But when pressed for details, she always says she can't discuss it. It's the perfect lie, isn't it? How do you disprove something that's supposedly too secret to talk about? He leaned forward, addressing the judge directly. "Your Honor, this is stolen valor in its most insidious form. She's not wearing a uniform she didn't earn or displaying medals she doesn't deserve. She's weaponizing the silence around legitimate classified operations to hide the fact that she's never done anything classified at all." The testimony continued for over an hour, with Jake methodically destroying my character and credibility. He called my mother as a witness, and she reluctantly confirmed that I had never discussed my military service in any detail, that I was frequently absent for work-related travel, that I had never brought home any military friends or colleagues. "She's always been very private about her job," my mother testified, her voice barely above a whisper. "She said it was government work, important work, but she could never really explain what she did. We just assumed—" "You assumed she was telling the truth about serving her country?" Jake's attorney prompted. "Yes," my mother said, and I felt something break inside my chest. "We wanted to believe she was doing something meaningful." The phrase hung in the air like an indictment. We wanted to believe. Not we believed, but we wanted to believe, as if my service was nothing more than a comforting fiction the family had chosen to accept rather than face the reality of my supposed failure. When the prosecution rested, the courtroom felt heavy with the weight of accumulated evidence. Jake had painted a devastating picture of systematic deception, supported by the testimony of family members who confirmed my secretiveness and inability to provide verifiable proof of my claims. Judge Martinez looked tired as he turned to our table. Mr. Chen, you may present your case. Michael rose slowly, his movements deliberate and calm. He didn't approach the witness stand or call any witnesses. Instead, he simply walked to the bailiff's desk and placed a single manila envelope on the polished wood surface. Your, honor, he said, his voice carrying a formality that seemed to change the atmosphere in the room. The defense respectfully requests that the court review a document for in-camera consideration. This document requires immediate judicial review under Federal Statute 18 U.S.C. 798 regarding the protection of classified information. Judge Martinez looked annoyed. He had clearly been expecting a more conventional defense, perhaps character witnesses or employment records. The mention of federal statutes and classified information seemed like a desperate attempt to complicate what should have been a straightforward case. Approach the bench, he said wearily. Michael carried the envelope forward, and I watched the judge's expression as he broke the unfamiliar red wax seal. The envelope bore no return address, no identifying marks except for a small embossed seal that most people wouldn't recognize. But I knew what it was: the official seal of the Office of the Director of National Intelligence. The judge slid out a single sheet of heavy paper and began to read. The change in his demeanor was immediate and profound. The casual boredom vanished, replaced by a rigid attention that transformed his entire posture. His eyes moved across the page once, then again, as if he couldn't quite believe what he was seeing. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pale mask of shock. His hands, which had been casually holding the paper, began to tremble slightly. When he looked up, his gaze swept past the lawyers, past my stunned family, and locked onto the two armed court officers stationed by the heavy oak doors. The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even Jake, who had been whispering confidently to his lawyers, fell silent as he sensed that something fundamental had shifted. The judge's voice, when it came, was strained and urgent, cutting through the silence like a blade. Officers, seal this courtroom immediately. Clear all non-essential personnel. The sound of the doors slamming shut was deafening. The heavy oak barriers that had seemed merely decorative suddenly revealed their true purpose as the electronic locks engaged with a series of solid thuds. The court reporter looked up in confusion as Judge Martinez pointed a trembling finger in her direction. You're off the record. Shut down your equipment now. Jake's confident expression dissolved into something approaching panic. He looked around the suddenly sealed courtroom, his lawyer's instincts telling him that whatever was happening was far beyond the scope of a simple will contest. Judge Martinez fixed his gaze on Jake, his voice now stripped of all judicial pleasantries and reduced to something cold and official. Mr. Jensen, he began, you are a civilian who has made specific claims under sworn testimony regarding the service status of a United States government employee. He held up the document, his hand still shaking slightly. The document I hold confirms that your sister's service record is classified at the highest levels of national security. Your accusations made under oath in a federal courtroom may constitute an attempt to publicly expose the operational status of a protected government operative. The words landed like hammer blows in the suffocating silence. Jake's face went from confused to terrified as the implications began to sink in. This wasn't about family drama anymore. This wasn't about money or inheritance or sibling rivalry. This was about federal crimes and national security. Furthermore, the judge continued, his voice gaining strength as he processed the full weight of what he held, your accusations of stolen valor regarding an active duty intelligence officer constitute potential interference with ongoing classified operations. You will remain silent while this court determines the appropriate response to this situation. He turned to address the armed officers. Notify the U.S. Marshals Service immediately. This courtroom is now under federal jurisdiction, pending review by appropriate security personnel. The transformation was complete. What had begun as a family dispute over a will had become a federal incident requiring intervention by law enforcement agencies that most people never had reason to encounter. Jake sat frozen in the witness stand, his expensive suit suddenly seeming like costume jewelry, his confidence replaced by the dawning realization that he had stumbled into something far more dangerous than he could have imagined. Judge Martinez then turned to me, and for the first time, he truly saw me. His expression softened with a deep, profound respect that bordered on fear. "Ma'am," he said, the honorific now carrying absolute sincerity, "I offer my profound apologies for this situation. This court had no knowledge of your protected status." I gave him a slow, deliberate nod, the kind of acknowledgement that passed between professionals who understood the weight of secrets. "Thank you, Your Honor. We will adjourn to my chambers immediately to finalize the execution of your father's will. This matter is concluded." I stood and followed Judge Martinez toward his chambers, leaving my family alone in the sealed courtroom. I didn't look back at Jake, who remained frozen in the witness chair like a statue of disbelief. I didn't acknowledge my mother, whose face had gone white with shock and something that might have been shame. In the judge's chambers, the execution of the will was swift and anticlimactic. Legal documents were signed, official seals were applied, and the matter that had brought us to court was resolved with efficient bureaucratic precision. But the real resolution was taking place outside, where federal marshals were taking Jake's statement and beginning the process that would forever change his understanding of his place in the world. When Michael and I emerged from the courthouse 30 minutes later, I saw them. Two stone-faced U.S. Marshals were escorting Jake to an unmarked black sedan parked at the curb. His expensive suit was rumpled, his confident posture replaced by the hunched shoulders of a man who had suddenly discovered that the world was far more complex and dangerous than he had ever imagined. For a moment, our eyes met across the courthouse steps. In his gaze, I saw terror so profound it seemed to have hollowed him out completely. But beneath the fear, there was something else, a desperate, childish plea. He was looking for his sister, the one who had always been invisible, the one who was supposed to quietly absorb whatever punishment the family decided to dish out. I held his gaze for a long moment, my expression unreadable. Then I gave an almost imperceptible shake of my head and walked away without looking back. The connection that had bound us together through a lifetime of shared family dysfunction had finally snapped. The war was over, and I was done being invisible. 6 months later, I stood in a place that existed on no public maps, in a ceremony that would never be reported in any newspaper. The Hall of Honor at DIA headquarters was a solemn room where the agency recognized achievements that could never be publicly acknowledged. The walls were lined with photographs of operations that had saved lives, prevented terrorist attacks, and protected American interests around the world. Director Catherine Walsh stood before me, holding the Defense Intelligence Director's Award, a medal that fewer than 50 people had ever received. The citation was deliberately vague, commending my exceptional service in the protection of American assets and the successful conclusion of Operation Lighthouse, the code name for the Prague mission that had taken me away from my father's deathbed. She pinned the medal to my dress uniform, her eyes conveying the respect that my own family had never been capable of expressing. "Your sacrifice has not gone unnoticed, Echo 9, she said quietly. "Your country owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." After the ceremony, my colleagues surrounded me. There were no loud congratulations or performative displays of celebration. Instead, there were quiet handshakes, knowing nods, and shared glances that spoke volumes more than words ever could. These people were my true family, bound not by blood, but by shared secrets, mutual trust, and an understanding of the silent sacrifices we all made. Later that week, I was back at my desk, analyzing satellite imagery for an upcoming operation, when my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. My finger hovered over the notification, and I knew who it was before I even opened it. The message was from my mother, and it was exactly what I'd expected. A frantic, desperate plea wrapped in a lifetime of entitled expectations. "Sarah," it read, "Jake's legal troubles are destroying the family. His law practice is being investigated. He can't get security clearances for government contracts anymore. Please, you have to help. Can you make some calls? Can you tell them it was all a misunderstanding? I read the message twice, waiting for some echo of the old anger or resentment to surface. But there was nothing, just a vast, quiet stillness where my family drama used to live. The message wasn't just about Jake. It was a desperate attempt to pull me back into their chaos, to force me back into the role of the invisible daughter who was expected to fix their problems while remaining grateful for their scraps of attention. I looked at her words, then at the global operations map glowing on my computer screen, showing the real work that gave my life meaning and purpose. The choice was never clearer. With calm, steady movements, I deleted the entire message thread and blocked the number. Then I returned to my analysis of satellite imagery, showing suspected terrorist training camps in Yemen, work that would help prevent attacks on American soil. My family had believed that legacy was measured in stock portfolios and real estate holdings, in newspaper clippings about successful business deals, and public recognition. I had learned that true legacy was something different entirely. It was a name whispered with respect in rooms where the fate of nations was decided. It was lives saved by decisions made in shadows. It was service that would never be acknowledged but would always matter. Jake had wanted to prove I was nobody special. In the end, he had simply proven that he had no idea how special someone could be while remaining completely invisible. The quiet daughter he had dismissed and diminished had been protecting his comfortable world all along, fighting wars he couldn't imagine in places he would never know existed. As I worked late into the evening, preparing for another mission that would take me away from everything familiar, I thought about my father's final words in his will. He had wished that someday my sacrifice would be properly recognized. He never could have imagined that the recognition would come not from family dinners or newspaper articles, but from a medal ceremony in a room that didn't exist, attended by people whose names would never be publicly known. I was Echo 9. I was seen, and that was enough. The snow began falling outside my office window as I prepared to board a flight that would officially take me to a budget conference in Denver, but would actually deliver me to a safe house in Bucharest, where I would begin the most dangerous mission of my career. My family thought I pushed papers in a government building. Tomorrow night, I would be preventing a nuclear weapons transaction that could reshape the balance of power in Eastern Europe. Some people measure their worth by the applause they receive. I measured mine by the silence I maintained and the secrets I kept. In the end, the invisible daughter had become the most powerful person in the room. Jake would spend the rest of his career wondering what he had stumbled into that day in court. I would spend mine making sure he never found out. The phone rang with an encrypted call from Bucharest. Director Walsh's voice was calm and professional as she briefed me on the mission parameters. As I listened to the details of the operation that would occupy the next several months of my life, I felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling around my shoulders like armor. Echo 9, she said as we concluded the briefing. This one matters. If we fail, we're looking at a potential nuclear incident in the heart of Europe. Understood, I replied, already mentally shifting into operational mode. I won't let you down. You never do, she said, and the line went dead. I gathered my operational gear and headed for the door, leaving behind another life, another identity, another comfortable lie that kept the world safe. Somewhere in Chicago, Jake was probably lying awake, wondering how his perfect plan had gone so wrong. Somewhere in the same city, my mother was probably staring at her blocked number, unable to understand why her daughter wouldn't return her calls. I was already gone, fading back into the shadows where I belonged, where I was most useful, where I could do the work that really mattered. The invisible daughter had learned to weaponize her invisibility, and the world was safer because of it. The courthouse doors had closed behind me for the last time. The family that had never seen me was finally free to forget I existed. And I was free to be who I'd always been, a ghost in the machine, a shadow in service of the light, a secret that would die with me and a legacy that would live forever in the lives I'd saved. Echo 9 reporting for duty. Mission accepted. Objective. Keep the world safe from threats it would never know existed. The war was over. The real war was just beginning. And this time, I was fighting on my own terms. Sometimes the people who seem the most ordinary are actually the most extraordinary. If you've ever felt invisible, if you've ever been underestimated, if you've ever served in ways that couldn't be recognized, this community sees you. Share your story in the comments below. Here, your quiet service is always acknowledged and never forgotten.